The years before World War I were a time of peace and growing prosperity for many Europeans. Popular magazines displayed the latest products of an ever-expanding economy. Fascinating items that promised to end drudgery and add excitement to life. Ads urged businessmen to trade in their horse-drawn buggies for motorized trucks. Speed and efficiency were central to this wondrous new age of advanced technology. Europe's wealth rested on two things: its industrial strength and its domination of the rest of the world. This was the golden age of European imperialism. By 1900, European powers owned or controlled most of Africa and Asia, and all or part of every other continent as well. While imperialism was evidence of European strength, it also revealed a basic dependency. Each country's prosperity hinged on its ability to maintain and expand its colonial empire. This created competition among the various imperialist powers for control of foreign territory. Imperialist rivalry is considered a primary cause of World War I.
Around 1880, a mad grab for new colonies began among the European powers. Over the next 20 years, they seized vast areas of the globe, as wealth and power came increasingly to depend on colonial possessions. Britain led the way in this new round of colonial conquest, having long since outstripped all competitors in the contest for colonies and for trade routes that had begun 400 years earlier. For most of the 19th century, Britain was also Europe's leading manufacturing country, as the wealth from its empire promoted rapid industrial expansion. This, in turn, created pressure for further colonization, to provide factories with a constant flow of raw materials unavailable at home, secure markets where manufacturers could sell their products, and safe places for them to invest their growing wealth. India helped fulfill these needs. Britain had long been dominant in India through the British East India Company. Following a series of uprisings in the 1850s, the British government actually seized control, and the vast subcontinent of ancient civilizations became the centerpiece of the British Empire. In Africa, Britain faced competition from other European powers, whose appetite for colonies expanded as their industries grew. Only 10% colonized in 1880, Africa was 90% under European control by 1900. Britain and France grabbed the largest shares, with the rest left to Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. In Asia, China was the biggest remaining prize. Here, the once powerful Manchu dynasty was losing its grip on the world's most populous nation. The imperialist powers struggled among themselves for shares of the lucrative China trade. By 1900, most of Asia was controlled by one European power or another, either through outright colonization or through treaties creating spheres of influence, which granted the holder the right to exclusive economic exploitation. From then on, with Asia and Africa divided among them, any territorial gain on the part of one power could only be made at the expense of another. And Britain was the envy of all the other imperialist powers. A nation of some 40 million inhabitants in 1900, Britain ruled an empire with 10 times that population, covering territory almost 100 times as great as Britain itself. With colonies stretching over huge areas of every continent, the British could rightfully boast that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Middle-class British families could relax over their afternoon tea, secure in the knowledge that Britain's huge empire, its well-developed industry, and its all-powerful navy guaranteed their safety and comfort. The history of tea illustrates many aspects of imperialism. A favorite drink in the Orient for centuries, tea was introduced in Europe around 1600 by Dutch and British traders. These were the early days of imperialism, when in some parts of the world, European countries sought to monopolize trade rather than establish colonies. As trade expanded, tea continued to grow in popularity, although even in the 18th century, it was a luxury. The palatial offices of the British East India Company in London reflected the wealth derived from this trade. The company was powerful enough to pressure the British Parliament to pass a series of measures in 1773, assuring its monopoly of the tea trade. This monopoly had repercussions in the empire. It caused anger in the American colonies and encouraged their rebellion against the British Crown. The 13 colonies, however, were of far less concern to the British than their holdings in India. And tea figured prominently in India's importance. By the late 19th century, after Britain's conquest of India, tea was no longer a luxury. Big tea companies now owned huge plantations in India and Ceylon. Using modern machinery and technology, and with an unlimited supply of cheap labor, tea companies could mass-produce tea and sell it cheaply. For the millions of Britons beginning to appreciate it for the first time, tea was a daily reminder of the higher standard of living that imperialism was providing. Some questioned the morality of a prosperity based on imperialism. Was it right, they asked, that one nation's wealth be based on the exploitation of so many millions around the world? That so much of a poor country's fertile land be set aside to grow products for export? While periodic famines took millions of Indian lives? But most Britons believed imperialism to be both necessary and noble. Like other imperialists, they believed their culture to be superior to that of their subject peoples. To them, colonial rule was bringing the blessings of civilization to the backward peoples of the world. Medicine, transportation, administration, and often Christianity. Many saw colonial rule as a mission, a responsibility, what the British poet Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. Imperialist rivalry caused numerous localized disputes, wars, and skirmishes around the turn of the century.
Japan and China over Korea and Formosa. The United States and Britain over Venezuela. Britain and France over the Sudan. Spain and the United States over Cuba and the Philippines. Britain and the Dutch colonists over South Africa. Germany and France over Morocco. Russia and Japan over Manchuria.
Japan's victory in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War was a humiliating defeat for the huge but backward Russian Empire. For the first time in modern history, a European power had been defeated by a non-European nation. Russia's century-long eastward expansion into Asia had been checked. Japan was on the rise. The effects of these conflicts were threatening the balance of power in Europe. Germany, a latecomer in the rivalry for colonies, was beginning to test its strength. Determined to industrialize rapidly and build its military strength, Germany in the early 1900s passed Britain as the major European producer of iron and steel, the most critical industrial products. But when it came to colonial possessions, Germany remained a second-rate power, unable to make much headway against the British and French. Frustrated by this conflict between industrial might and territorial inferiority, Germany felt it increasingly necessary to challenge its imperialist rivals. In 1911, a dispute broke out between Germany and France as Kaiser Wilhelm II sought to block France from gaining complete control of the Moroccan port of Agadir. Wilhelm yearned to establish Germany as a great world power and decided to embark on an ambitious program of naval expansion, challenging Britain's long-standing supremacy of the seas. Britain, determined to remain ahead, increased production too. Soon, the two nations were spending huge sums of money in their rivalry for superior naval strength. This contest was only one part of a continuing buildup of arms and armies going on throughout Europe. Everywhere, factories turned out weapons of incredible effectiveness. The military inspired near reverence, and its leaders played prominent roles in the governments of most nations. This military buildup soon developed a momentum of its own. Each nation wanted to remain one step ahead of its potential enemies. Yet every new weapon added to one nation's arsenal, every new division added to its army, was quickly matched and bettered in this endless cycle. Once the process had started, no nation felt it could afford to stop. The arms race took place along with a developing system of alliances that started in 1879, when Germany allied itself with Austria-Hungary. Italy joined 3 years later in what was called the Triple Alliance. Alarmed at Germany's growing strength, Russia and France signed a counter-alliance in 1894. Tsar Nicholas II, ruler of Europe's most notorious autocracy, was welcomed as a hero in Paris, birthplace of Europe's democratic tradition. Britain had always been reluctant to form alliances, preferring to follow a policy of splendid isolation, relying for protection on its navy and on the balance of power among the feuding nations of Europe. But by the turn of the century, even mighty Britain was worried by Germany's growing strength. This worry led Britain early in the century to reach agreement with France and Russia against Germany and its allies. In every country, military leaders began mapping battle plans, just in case. Was a major war inevitable?
Certainly, I think so, said France's top general. It will come. I shall fight it, and I shall win.
This was the mood in Europe. When, in Sarajevo, a Slavic nationalist murdered the heir to the Austrian throne. Austria, desperate to save its empire, decided to move against Serbia, where nationalist agitation seemed to be centered. As Serbians hurried to defend their country, Russia pledged to support her Slavic cousins against Austria. Germany promised to aid Austria if Russia intervened, while the French prepared to back up their Russian ally. As the system of alliances came into play, mobilization orders went out all across Europe. Finally, on July 28, 1914, Austria declared war against Serbia. One by one, the nations of Europe picked up their weapons. The spirit of nationalism had heightened tensions between nations, while firing the patriotic passions within each nation. The intensive arms race had encouraged each nation to equate its preservation with its military strength, creating a mood in which war seemed inevitable. The alliance system had virtually guaranteed that if a war erupted, it would engulf all of Europe. And at the root of it all was the fierce competition among the imperial powers to realize their national dreams by gaining control of the world's resources. The war, which became truly worldwide when the United States entered combat in April 1917, changed the world. At its start, British Foreign Minister Sir Edward Grey said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our time." And he was right. Europe never regained its dominant place in the world. Out of the ashes of the war rose a fearsome totalitarian movement that in 20 short years would lead to another, more terrible war.
The Great War was over. On the 11th of November 1918, an armistice had been signed. In Britain and France, the survivors celebrated victory, the return of peace, and the end of bloodshed. They'd left behind the nightmare lands of death and destruction created by 4 years of war. The cost of those years was almost beyond imagination, but somehow, somewhere, that cost would have to be counted. And the defeated would have to pay the price of peace. To the west of Paris stands the great palace of Versailles. It was here that the peace treaty with Germany would eventually be signed. But before that could happen, much had to be decided. In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference. But of all the statesmen who came to Paris to settle the peace, the most important were President Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, and Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. Each had very different ideas of what to do about the central problem of Germany. Clemenceau, like most Frenchmen, knew what he wanted out of the peace: revenge, reparations for the damage the French had suffered, and guarantees that a similar war would never, could never happen again. The idea that Germany should be let off lightly would have seemed sheer madness to Frenchmen who'd seen the effects of the German war machine on their own country. In order that scenes like this could never happen again, they wanted a Germany stripped of her wealth and armed forces. In contrast, Woodrow Wilson appeared to promise a just and lasting peace, not punishment. Europe acclaimed him as the great and good man from the New World. This was because his 14 points seemed to promise a new moral order in international affairs. No more secret diplomacy, reduction in armaments, and a League of Nations to protect all countries from aggression. He didn't want revenge as the French did, but there was no question that Germany should get off scot-free. But while Wilson was planning the future of Europe, Americans were rapidly losing interest as their boys came back home. They wanted a peace that wouldn't involve them in European affairs. Surprisingly, it was Lloyd George who fought most strongly for German interests at Versailles. Behind him was a public elated by victory, but eager for revenge. The Prime Minister appeared to share their opinion, but really had no time for those who wanted to destroy Germany. What mattered to him was that Germany should be made stable and allowed to recover her strength as a trading partner. This was the kind of Germany he feared, a land of miserable refugees, poverty, homelessness and starvation. all conditions likely to provide a perfect breeding ground for the new disease from the East, communism. In Berlin, his fears had already been realized. A communist revolt had broken out there in early January. While the leaders tried to rouse the mass of the people, armed communists occupied key public buildings. This was a direct challenge to Ebert, acting president of the new German government. He had to turn for support to army generals who brought in bands of ex-soldiers and turned them loose on the communists. Berlin briefly became a battlefield. Within a week, the revolt was crushed. Communist leaders were rounded up and some brutally murdered. Post-war politics in Germany were off to a bloody start. Meanwhile, in Paris, whilst the German government was squashing the threat to its own existence, the Allied leaders were arguing their way over the whole future of the German people. Under their hands, the map of Europe was drawn and redrawn again. At last, after more than 3 months of discussion, they presented the terms of their treaty to the Germans. Germany lost land in the east, the west, and the north. In the east, the most important of those losses was the wide strip of territory given to the newly independent Poland, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. While on the west, France took back the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and was also given the right to mine coal in the Saar, an area placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. To protect France, Germany was forbidden to station soldiers in the Rhineland, an area which was to be occupied by Allied troops until 1935. It was not only the loss of territory which Germany resented, but also the fact that Czechoslovakia and Poland now contained large numbers of Germans. And as if to add insult to injury, the treaty forbade German-speaking Austria to unite with Germany. Her fortifications were to be destroyed. Her army was to be reduced to 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, and to accept blame for starting the war and pay reparations. In protest at Scapa Flow, the British naval base, the Germans scuttled their fleet rather than hand it over to the Allies. It was a last defiant gesture. Germany would have to agree to the terms. She was in no position to restart the war. So, in the high summer of 1919, the German delegates were brought to the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to sign the peace treaty. It was a compromise peace that satisfied not even one single Allied leader, and predictably the Germans loathed it. Inside Germany, the people had been faced with difficult political choices. The communists had already tried and failed to wreck the government. Other parties suggested a variety of ways of dealing with Germany's problems. But when Ebert became president of the new German Republic in August 1919, he found himself facing other threats. There were, for instance, the extreme nationalists who couldn't bring themselves to believe that the German army had lost the war and often greeted returning troops as heroes. They'd already blamed the government for signing the armistice, and now they blamed them for signing the shameful Treaty of Versailles. And then there were the Freikorps, or Free Corps, bands of ex-servicemen who'd tasted blood and power in their battles with the communists. In March 1920, these two forces combined to try and take over Berlin. The army refused to fire on the Freikorps, who were only defeated when the workers of Berlin went on strike and refused to cooperate with the rebels. Political extremism seemed to have become part of everyday life. And then there was the vital question of reparations. In 1921, the Allies were still discussing how much Germany should finally pay. Aristide Briand, the French Prime Minister, wanted a definite sum to be fixed quickly, and Germany made to pay. The rebuilding of war-damaged France was costing the country a great deal of money. Why should the French be taxed more heavily to pay for all this, when the money could be squeezed out of Germany? But the Germans, who'd been summoned to hear the Allied demands, protested that these would place an intolerable burden on their people. They'd argued that the Germany to which they were returning had suffered poverty and unemployment in the years since the war, and couldn't afford the vast sums demanded by the Allies. Germany was already in a bitter mood. Might not reparations only make things worse? But these arguments didn't impress the Allies, who fixed a sum of £6,600 million for the Germans to pay. That sum would have to be paid in goods as well as money. Most would come from here in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. But at the end of 1922, the Germans fell behind with their payments, and Raymond Poincaré, the new French Prime Minister, decided to act. If Germany wouldn't pay in full and on the nail, then France would help herself. So, on the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr to force the Germans to pay up. There was, of course, after Versailles, no German army big enough to stop them. At first, the French believed that they could make the Germans work for them. But suddenly, German politicians and people were united in a common cause: hatred of the French. And huge protest meetings were held all over Germany. Workers in the Ruhr refused to cooperate with the enemy, and the German government supported the strikers. Germany's industrial heart stopped beating, and the goods trains, which should have been carrying German wealth to France, lay idle in the sidings. The French hit back by bringing in their own workers to get things moving again. Their attitude towards the Germans in the Ruhr began to harden. They tried to cut the Ruhr off from the rest of the country. German visitors were searched as if they were entering a foreign land. They deported the leaders of the passive resistance, German officials, and even the police. The result was violence. German workers had been killed in riots at Essen in March. Their funeral was turned into a vast demonstration of protest. Hatred grew. Germans began killing French soldiers, and at the funeral for one of them, tempers flared into acts of brutality. In 1923 was disastrous for Germany. In that year, the great German inflation reached its peak. For some time, the value of the mark had been dropping, and as the value of the notes decreased, so the amount of notes needed to buy things grew. Banks became more and more hard-pressed to meet the ever-increasing demand for paper money. For their customers, suitcases replaced wallets. To meet this crisis and pay the strikers in the Ruhr, the government simply printed more money. And as it lost its value, so it cost more and more to pay wages to buy hundreds of thousands. Millions, whatever figure was printed on the notes, really meant nothing. The German mark was worthless. As in a fearful dream, people's life savings were blown away like leaves in a gale. As Germany slid towards disaster, Gustav Stresemann was appointed Chancellor. It was a time of crisis. The loss of production in the Ruhr was making inflation even worse, and Stresemann realized that the only way to help the economy back to normal was to call off resistance there and get production going again. The government also announced that Germany would resume the payment of reparations. It was the only possible way of getting the French out. But to the nationalists, it looked like yet another pathetic surrender to Germany's enemies. General Ludendorff, who'd never accepted that Germany had been defeated, gave his support to Adolf Hitler, the leader of the new National Socialist Party. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, they decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison, where he brooded on his failure for a few months in rather comfortable surroundings.